Morning, everyone. It is Sunday right here in Hollywood, and I am here to bring you episode 23 of Klugula Reads His Classics. For those of you who've been following along, we are continuing into the final moments of Below the Surface, that story I wrote at age 15. Again, my response to The Abyss, Leviathan, Deep Star 6, all those wonderful horror sci-fi underwater movies of 1989. So we are in the penultimate episode. We have two chapters left after today. Tomorrow will be the final installment Below the Surface. So let's get right into it. This is chapter 10. It's been 3 hours. Laurie sat on one of the beds in the men's sleeping quarters. The pounding continued on the only door out. I know, I know. Alan rubbed his thigh and then his forehead deep in thought. We can't stay here forever, for Christ's sakes. It was the first time Alyssa spoke since she'd seen Walter disposed of. We need food and water, Lake spoke this time. I say we get in the beds and take off. Leave that man, whoever he is, here. Laurie began pacing as she had every 5 minutes of the past 3 hours. We'll be to the surface in less than half an hour. The pod holds 3 hours. When did you learn so much? And what about Carrie? Alyssa stood up. We can't leave her. She could be alive. And she couldn't be. Laurie turned to Alyssa. We don't know. Who the hell made you God? Alyssa screamed back to defend herself and Carrie. I'm going up to the surface with anyone who wants to come. Laurie looked around the room. Alan slowly nodded his head, having had a silent conflict within himself. He couldn't decide if he would go or not. Lake looked at Alan and then to Laurie. He nodded to her and bowed his head. He also had a slight disagreement within himself, not wanting to leave his brother to rot below the surface, and not wanting to leave Carrie, who could possibly be alive. But he had to think of himself, which he thought selfish, but in a situation like this, yourself always comes first. Alyssa looked at Laurie. Yes, she began to cry, and Lake put his arms around her shoulders and squeezed, trying to hold back a flood of tears that were beginning to well up in his eyes. Laurie looked down at her companions and bowed her head. She whispered a short prayer for her deceased friends and began to walk over to a bed. She climbed in and shut the door at the push of a button. She waited for the others to climb into their pods. They did so, and Laurie took one last look. She pushed the small red button on the control board and was soon on her way to the safety of daylight. Alan looked around the room and remembered his few days at Frontier 3, his discovery with Carrie, his excitement of the entire journey, then his wife up above. He smiled a little smile to Alyssa across the room, and a tiny tear fell down his cheek. He turned to his control panel and pushed the small red button that Walter had emphasized over and over. Now don't forget this button. It's hard to find, but it's crucial that you know, he had said. Alan smiled at the irony of it all and pushed the button. He would be with his family soon. Alyssa still had tears streaming down her face as she thought of Walter and the first time they made love below the surface. She then thought of James and her unforgettable experience with him. She managed a weak little smile as she thought of him dead. Rot, she whispered as she pushed the button to be sent to the surface and to leave hell behind. Lake looked across the room and saw his friends gone. He thought of Walter and his meeting with Laurie. He was sad, but no tears would let themselves fall. You're doing pretty good with me, Laurie's voice echoed in his mind. He looked around the room and whispered a prayer for his role model, his best friend, his brother. He cried and remembered his uncontrollable excitement to be here. Here, he thought, in hell. He slammed his palm to the tiny button and was sent flying through the water at a remarkable speed, never to see the water again without shivering at the thought of this horrible experience below the surface of the Mariana Trench waters. Carrie woke in a shivering fit. Scene change. Carrie woke in a shivering fit. She shook uncontrollably. She rolled onto her stomach and looked up to where Johnson should have been, but found no one. She had trouble getting up because of a sharp pain in her back. She still shook as she stood onto her feet. Her back was stiff and burned, and she let out a small cry when she felt around to her back. She rushed up to the door of the sleeping quarters. She pounded on the door and received silence as an answer. As she turned around, she saw that Walter's body was gone. The dark corridor to the rest of the complex loomed ahead of her. She shivered again and remembered the women's sleeping quarters. She turned and hurried down the small hallway to her bedroom. All the bed pods were in their proper places. She looked around the room and back out into the complex. She wondered where her relative was and where her friends had gone. No matter now. She had to think of herself. If they were gone, then there was nothing she could do. Then there was her relative to think about. He could be out in those darkened corridors. But if she could get out in the pod, she'd be fine. She got herself into the bed and pushed the button for the door to close. She watched the sliding door close, and it reminded her of a prison. This place, Frontier 3 itself, was a prison. She pushed the button marked Send and was going out of the complex very slowly, not at all as fast as it should have been. She wriggled in her confinement. It went even slower than at first. Finally, it came to a complete stop. She looked around and was surrounded only by the walls that held the bed. She looked below to the room where she had just left. It was dark. The power was out. Carrie was trapped below the surface, almost completely alone. Chapter 9, folks. So we are tomorrow going to move into chapter 10. I'm sorry, chapter 11, the final chapter and also an epilogue. So stay tuned for that thrilling last few minutes of this particular story, again, that I wrote at age 15. So yay me, age 15, for writing something this long and extensive. Very poorly, but it was written. That's the important thing. So please return tomorrow, subscribe below, like, all that good stuff, if indeed that's something you want to do. Catch up on all the prior readings, including everything leading up to this moment below the surface. Until tomorrow, I will offer my usual quadruple S. Stay safe, stay secure, stay smart, and stay well stocked. Until tomorrow, have a good one, guys. Bye.